Good morning, everyone, again. I'll be covering the study that the Centre did with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and it's titled Hostile Information Activities in the Far East. I'll cover the definition of both hostile information activities and what we consider to be the Far East in a little bit. But what was the scope of this presentation and the report was that we outline what hostile information activities are and what is the information environment in Asia, which is important to study when we understand how this can be influenced. And then we study 4 case studies from different parts of Asia. Namely, we look at Taiwan, we look at Hong Kong, and specifically the activity related to the protest movement. We look at the West Papuan region of Indonesia, which is the easternmost province of Indonesia, as well as the Philippines, which some people refer to as patient zero of the hostile information activity. So diving straight through into the report. So what are hostile information activities? For this study, we used the Facebook definition of information operations to be the guide of what we define as hostile information activities. Essentially, we defined it as actions taken by actors to distort domestic or foreign political sentiment, and in order to achieve a strategic outcome. So we identified 5 strategic outcomes that a hostile actor can seek to achieve. Commonly is to shape external and international opinion. Also within the region, we find that gaining domestic political influence is also commonplace, and also to affect domestic politics and policy making. Stifling dissent and discouraging opposing views is an outcome used by political actors, as well as to create a justification for further diplomatic action or economic action by a hostile actor. In most cases, these are states. And also, it's important to recognize that hostile information activities, they exist along the entire spectrum of what is legitimate to what is ill-intentioned. So before I go into the case studies, let me elaborate a bit on the context. So the information environment in Asia is very much determined by the existing vulnerabilities, and these are racial, cultural, and societal vulnerabilities. So for example, if we look at the countries that we looked at for the study, and the countries we looked at were China, Singapore, South Korea, Japan, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, and Vietnam. These are countries that are rife with racial, cultural, and societal differences. For example, by some standards, Singapore is noted to be the most racially and religiously diverse in the world. And these countries are also embroiled in a region that is the butt of increasing geopolitical competition with the rise of China, as well as the role of the US in the region. And also, there's a rapid expansion of internet access within this region. So you see the widespread, or rather the increase in internet connectivity within the region. While no country in this region admits to conducting hostile information activities, many have started to introduce legislation to combat some of these things. So recently, we see examples of Indonesia, Vietnam, Singapore introduce legislation to combat what they define to be fake news or hoaxes or hostile activity. Similarly, with the increased access of telecommunications technology that has contributed to economic growth, it has also increased the vulnerabilities because of these existing racial and cultural and societal fractures. Thirdly, it's important to understand the information environment in Asia is somewhat different from what is commonly observed in Europe, in that there's generally perceived to be lower levels of media freedom in Asia. For example, in the recent 2019 study, none of the Asian countries were ranked in the top 40 for media and press freedom. But increasingly, this is being undercut by the popularity of new media and the existence of virtual communities, which I will elaborate on further as we go into the case studies. Also, interestingly, in Asia, there's considerable variation in the usage rate of social media. So for example, if we look at Southeast Asia, social media penetration is relatively high. We're looking at something like 61% use social media actively, and this rate is rising. So you see a 6% rise from 2018 as opposed to 2019. And you compare this with Central and Southern Asia, these are much lower, averaging around 20%. But if you look at countries specifically, you have countries that have very, very high social media usage. For example, it's noted that Philippines has the highest social media usage in the world. And an average user uses something like 4 hours of social media a day. But on the other end of the spectrum, you have countries in Asia like Japan, who possibly because of Japanese productivity use very little social media. So they average something like 36 minutes a day on social media. So another reason for the increase in Asia is because the smartphone is becoming very accessible. It's becoming very cheap. So you see this drive of Chinese smartphone players that have launched their products into the market. So you see very niche products and Chinese brands like Oppo and Vivo, and to some extent Xiaomi, that have made access to smartphones cheap. And it's not only the hardware, so it's also the networks. So for example, you see Facebook launching their Free Basics program, which essentially provides free access to the suite of Facebook-owned platforms to some of these rural communities and to some of these areas where internet connection is expensive. So it brings connectivity of these applications to a larger group of people. Also interestingly, Google in Asia has, and in many parts of the world, to be fair, have launched the Project Loon, which essentially brings internet connectivity to the rural areas where they don't have, where traditionally they're not connected digitally. So I'll just dive straight into the case studies. So the first case study we looked at was Taiwan, and the report assesses that the activities in Taiwan seek mainly to affect domestic politics as well as to justify diplomatic action. And we see three main narratives in Taiwan. First is about the inevitability of reunification with China. Second is about the price of separation. And third are narratives like broadly designed to weaken democracy as well as to delegitimize the Taiwanese government. So the information environment in Taiwan is highly digital. You have a very tech-savvy population. And you see hostile information activities across all digital mediums. But what you see importantly is that there are two main mediums. One is the use of close messaging apps. So Line is increasingly popular, and it's very popular in Taiwan, and which makes it a problem to detect some of these hostile information activities. Another platform that's very popular is the use of PTT, which is an online bulletin. So it has something like 1.5 million registered users within Taiwan. And also it generates about 5,000 comments from different users, authentic and inauthentic, every day. And this information, importantly, both online and PTT is not confined to these mediums, because what you see in Taiwan, where you have a relatively diverse media, is that you have journalists that just stick to these platforms and just look for information. And when it comes out with little fact-checking, it's reproduced on news sites. So you have the legitimization of information with very little fact-checking in Taiwan, and that doesn't help the spread of hostile information activities. So importantly, some people, or some studies have regarded Taiwan to be the playground of hostile information activities, because you see a variety of tactics and techniques being employed. So for example, in October 2019, you see the Wiki Wars in Taiwan, where there were where the BBC estimated 1,600 edits across 22 Wikipedia pages in Taiwan that essentially changed the content of Taiwan from Taiwan being a state to being a province, and various examples of it. And also the use of proxies. So you see content being made that's more believable. So you have linguistic idiosyncrasies removed, and you see linguists being hired to produce content that is more believable. So as a whole, the information environment in Taiwan is seen as again, the playground of disinformation. And you see that the full suite of information, of different mediums being used in Taiwan. So if we go to the next example, which is Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is interesting because majority of hostile information activities are centered around the extradition law protests. And the main narratives that we see are the ones that condemn protesters and frame them to be destroying the country and being destructive. So, and support for the Hong Kong police and the maintenance of the rule of law and the system that is established. And thirdly is about the Western involvement in protests. So you see narratives of the involvement of the UK or the US being commonplace. Interestingly, there's also a growing number of English language tweets, presumably in response to the growing international interest in the protests. So for example, you see on the 1st of July, there was a huge spike in the number of English language tweets. And that coincided with a significant event in the protest, which is when the protesters stormed the Legislative Council, and then there was a lot of international interest in that activity. An interesting trend in Hong Kong is also a lot of these activities aimed at individuals. So you see when prominent individuals, both within Hong Kong as well as internationally, come out in support of the protests, you see a huge amount of hostile information activities being targeted at them. Example is on October 4th, the general manager of the Houston Rockets of the NBA tweeted in support of the protests, and it was estimated that, or rather the Wall Street Journal in this case estimated something along the lines of 168,000 tweets that were directed at him within a span of 6 days. So specific individuals are definitely targeted as part of the Hong Kong protests as well. So the third, which is a very interesting case study and a little known case study, is on West Papua, which is the easternmost province in Indonesia. So some of context, so for a very long time there's been a pro-independence movement in West Papua. So we see that the activities in that region being aimed at shaping international perceptions of these movements and painting them in a certain negative light. So although it's illegal in Indonesia, so they have a law that makes hoaxes, what they define to be hoaxes, illegal, there's an entire ecosystem of buzzers which are essentially entities or people that promote content, and you have fake news factories. And interestingly, you have professional communications consultancy services that provide this full suite of services that can be tailored according to the desired outcome. So two of these things that we see, not unique to West Papua, but we see it as a trend in that region, which is the creation of brands. So essentially, you have brands created by some of these consultancy services that create news websites that come with an entire suite of social media applications. So we see something like 42 of these sites come up, and they brand themselves as news sites, and then they get reproduced by somewhat legitimate news sites further on. And they mimic legitimate news organizations, and they do gather a reasonable following and reach. So another interesting trend in West Papua is the trend of typo squatting, which is, for example, to introduce typos within popular handles so that people inadvertently follow them, but actually what they're actually following is inauthentic content, or in some instances, complete mistruths that are produced by some of these handles. The last case study is on the Philippines. My colleague Sebastian will elaborate in some length about the Philippines later, so I'll just cover briefly about it. So in Philippines, we see the activities mainly aimed at gaining domestic political influence, and we see it used largely by domestic political actors. And the main narratives that we see are important narratives spreading or supporting the popular policies, which is notably, like, for example, the war on drugs, as about the corruption of political figures. Usually this happens on both sides, but usually they're targeted against opposition politicians, and also narratives designed to spread distrust in mainstream media to guide the crowd and the audiences according to these alternative media sites. And there's an entire political trolling industry that my colleague Sebastian will go in great lengths later about. But what we see a trend in Philippines is that there is a shifting away from the traditional, what you would classify to be a very rudimentary way of spreading disinformation, which is very clickbaity, to leveraging on trusted communities of influencers and micro-influencers who have been bought into this industry, who then help spread some of this content. So that's what we see interesting about the Philippines. So the next, I'll show a quick video, which is to drive the point that the hostile information activity environment in Asia is not that much different from what we see in Europe. And like what Director Yanis spoke about in opening, is that this is a global problem, and it's not something that is confined to Asia, let alone to Europe or the North Atlantic region.
Foreign interference can take various forms, through diplomatic channels, covert intelligence agents, the media, non-governmental organizations, or movements that seemingly support a cause. But these are now shifting online, where technology is used to exploit fault lines and hot-button issues. This means hostile information campaigns have become cheap, easy and effective. An instance was the Nancy Pelosi deep fake. A video of the American politician was doctored to make her sound drunk, and it went viral.
The combination of these online hostile information campaigns, or HICs as I call them, and the offline activities, foreign control media, sites, agents of influence, NGOs, groups of citizens who fan the flames knowingly or unknowingly, and all of this combines, it's extremely toxic, extremely powerful.
So the point of that very short video was to support one of our conclusions, which is that the strategic goals that were identified by some of these hostile actors and the techniques employed, it's not new, it's not different. They might have different nuances based on the cultural and the linguistic nuances of whatever region they operate in, but the techniques are not different. But it's definitely possible that the countries in Asia are more susceptible to some of these activities because you have some inherent vulnerabilities like distrust of official mass media sources, as well as a generally lower level of digital literacy due to generally lower levels of formal education, especially in the developing parts of Asia. And you have a less discerning audience, so things like critical thinking are not skills that we find common in some of these developing countries. And the third conclusion that the report makes is that it is very hard for the social media companies, and we must recognize that, to combat hostile information activities in Asia because it is very culturally and linguistically diverse. So we saw Facebook, for example, admitting that they were slow in combating the hate speech in the Rohingya crisis because they admitted that they simply didn't understand the language. And they had to subsequently hire 60 to 100 linguists to help them understand the language, no doubt very much later. So this paints the context, or rather the conclusions of the study. And the recommendations that the study makes it's something that we see commonly in many of the reports here, is that including in Asia, we need independent fact-checking because we see a lot of the migration of content from these inauthentic sources to somewhat legitimate news sites that have existed in a while, and you need an independent fact-checker in the middle of this to help audience discern what to believe and what not to believe. So some effort needs to be put into increasing digital literacy as well as helping to build a more critical thinking-based education. At the end of the day, building resilience is the best defense to combating some of these activities. So a strong, independent, and diverse media is definitely important. So we find in Asia, by many standards, lacking behind in press and media freedom. So some effort needs to be going towards promoting a more independent and diverse media. Another interesting trend, which I didn't cover earlier, was that you don't see as developed a civil society being generated in Asia to combat some of these hostile information activities as compared to Europe. So measures could be introduced to encourage civil society groups to both research and uncover some of these activities to aid both policymakers as well as the larger public to address some of these issues.